On the 4th of February 1931, a Story County mine surveyor named Harlan Voss climbed down the Union Shaft on the eastern slope of Mount Davidson to draw a final set of maps before the Comstock Merger Mines Company let the lower levels flood for good. He carried a carbide lamp, a plumb line, and a set of blueprints already 40 years out of date, because the men who had drawn the originals were dead, and the company that owned the claims had changed hands 4 times since the last dividend was paid to a shareholder. Voss's job was not to discover anything. It was to record what remained before the pumps went silent, and the water table, held back by machinery for 60 years, was finally allowed to rise and take back what men had spent 2 generations cutting out of the mountain. His field notebook, held today in the Nevada Historical Society's manuscript collection in Reno, describes drift after drift of square-set timber disappearing into darkness his lamp could not reach, ladders gone soft with rot, and a station at the 2,200-foot level where the air was still warm enough to fog his instrument glass, a full 60 years after the shaft was first sunk. He wrote one line that a later archivist underlined in pencil, twice. Below this point, the maps stop matching the ground. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What Voss was mapping was not a mine in the way the word is usually meant. By the time the Comstock Lode's Bonanza years ended, the companies charted along its 4-mile length had cut something closer to a buried settlement than a shaft. Estimates compiled from company records across the district put the total length of drifts, crosscuts, and connecting tunnels at more than 750 miles, threaded through a mountain that from the surface looks like any other range in western Nevada, scrub-covered and unremarkable, giving no hint of what had been hollowed out beneath it. Down inside it, miners built blacksmith shops to keep their tools sharp without riding a cage half a mile to the surface and back. They stabled mules at depth for years at a stretch, animals that went blind in the permanent dark and were kept there anyway, because hauling a mule up and down the shaft twice a day cost the company more than the ore it helped pull out. There were underground offices with roll-top desks bolted to bedrock, underground eating rooms where crews ate cold meals off tin plates a mile beneath the surface, underground shrines set up by Cornish and Irish miners who wanted somewhere below to leave a candle for a father or a brother the mountain had already taken. A visiting journalist touring the deep levels in the 1870s called it a city that had never seen the sun, and the phrase held for the rest of the century, repeated in guidebooks and mining journals long after the men who coined it had moved on to other districts. In 1883, a former U.S. Treasury clerk named Elliott Lode published a federal survey titled Comstock Mining and Miners, commissioned to document the district before its methods were lost, and his report is still the most detailed physical description of the underground city that survives. Lode described crews working stripped to the waist in stopes where the rock itself registered above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, ice delivered underground by the ton and melting within hours, and company physicians stationed at some stations for no purpose but treating heat prostration as it happened. The timbering that made all of it possible was itself an invention forced by necessity. A German-trained engineer named Philipp Deidesheimer designed a system of interlocking timber cubes, square sets, that could be stacked indefinitely to support ground too broken and too wide to hold any other way. And Lode's survey credits the method with making excavation possible at depths no other American mining district had yet attempted. Without it, the deepest drifts Voss walked through in 1931 would have caved in decades before he ever set foot in them. The lode Voss was mapping had not even been named for the man who worked it. In June 1859, 2 prospectors named Patrick McLaughlin and Peter O'Reilly uncovered a heavy blue-gray clay clogging their sluice box while working a placer claim on the eastern slope of the mountain, ore so rich in silver that assayers in California later valued it at thousands of dollars a ton. A third man working nearby, Henry Comstock, arrived after the discovery and talked the two into cutting him in on the claim by insisting, falsely, that he already held rights to the ground. McLaughlin and O'Reilly never got rich off the lode that carries Comstock's name. Both sold out within the year for a fraction of what the ground would eventually produce, and Comstock himself sold his own share not long after, dying broke in Montana a decade later. The real fortune came later, in October 1873, when four men, known across the district as the Bonanza Kings, John Mackay, James Fair, James Flood, and William O'Brien, tapped a body of ore inside the Consolidated Virginia mine, so large that a single year of production from what miners called the Big Bonanza outproduced most other American mining districts combined. It was ore from strikes like that one that built the underground city Voss walked through decades later, and by the time he made his final survey, almost none of the men who had found it were still alive to see what became of it. The reason those levels were being abandoned rather than worked out properly is its own piece of the record, and it has nothing to do with anything unexplained and everything to do with heat and water. Below roughly 2,000 feet, Comstock miners started hitting scalding water, some of it close to the boiling point, fed by hot springs running along the same fault system the whole Lode sat on. Men worked in relays of 20 minutes at a stretch in the hottest stopes, packed around with ice hauled down by the wagon load, because a full shift in that heat could kill a man where he stood, and Lode's survey lists heat prostration deaths in the dozens across the district through the 1870s alone. The Yellow Jacket Fire of April 1869 started in timber at depth and killed 36 miners who could not be reached through smoke-choked shafts before the surface crews sealed the openings to starve the fire of air, a decision that saved the surrounding workings and ended any chance for the men still trapped below. Adolf Sutro answered the heat and the water with an engineering project that took 9 years and roughly $4 million, a 4-mile drainage tunnel bored into the mountain from the Carson River side, dropping the deep levels more than 1,600 feet below their original stations and letting cool air move through the workings for the first time. Sutro spent years fighting the district's mining bank interests, led by William Sharon, before Congress and Eastern investors backed the project over local opposition, and when the tunnel finally connected with the Savage Mines works in 1878, the temperature at the junction dropped more than 20 degrees within the first week of ventilation. It solved the heat. It did not solve the arithmetic. By the 1890s, the richest ore was gone. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act had been repealed in Washington, and silver prices collapsed with it almost overnight. And one company after another let its lower workings go dark, rather than keep pumping against water that was winning anyway. The Comstock Merger Mines Company that sent Voss down in 1931 was one of the last outfits still trying to rework old ground and low-grade tailings with newer cyanide processing, and even that effort could not survive the price crash of the early Depression years. What Voss mapped that February was less a discovery than a burial, the last set of eyes on record before the water was finally allowed to do what it had wanted to do for 60 years. Nevada was not finished giving up buried things that decade, and 2 sites north and south of the Comstock make the pattern worth naming in full. In the summer of 1911, 2 guano miners named David Pugh and James Hart were digging bat droppings out of a cave near the Humboldt Sink to sell as fertilizer when their picks started turning up woven baskets, Thule duck decoys, and human remains instead of guano. The site, later named Lovelock Cave, was excavated first by Llewellyn L. Lode for the University of California in 1912, and again by Mark Raymond Harrington in 1924, and it produced 11 decoys bundled from Thule reeds, shaped and painted with mud and feathers to fool live ducks from the air, cached together and wrapped as if meant to be recovered later by hands that never came back for them. Radiocarbon testing decades afterward put some of the decoys at more than 2,000 years old, among the oldest confirmed hunting decoys anywhere in the world. The cave's dry conditions had also preserved partial human remains, and in the 1930s a mining engineer named John T. Reed published sensational newspaper accounts describing skeletons of unusual size recovered from the site, claims that fed directly into local northern Paiute oral tradition, already recorded by ethnographers years before the first pick struck guano, describing a people called the Sita who had taken shelter in the cave and been killed by the ancestors of the Paiute after seasons of conflict over the valley's hunting grounds. Physical anthropologists who later examined the surviving skeletal material found nothing to support the giant claims Reed had circulated, and most contemporary specialists treat that specific embellishment as a distortion layered on top of a real and well-documented site rather than evidence of anything unusual about the remains themselves. 2 decades after Lode's first survey, and roughly 300 miles south, Harrington opened another cave, this one cut into gypsum-bearing rock in the Frenchman Mountains outside Las Vegas. Work funded in part by the town's Chamber of Commerce during the very years construction crews a few miles away were pouring concrete for what would become Hoover Dam. Amateur diggers had already been probing the site informally for years before Harrington's team arrived in 1930 and worked it systematically through the following year, recovering dung, hide fragments, and bone from an extinct ground sloth, alongside worked wood, cordage, and fragments of atlatl darts. A worked stone point found lying in the same stratigraphic layer as the sloth remains became the center of the find, evidence Harrington read as proof that people in the Nevada desert had lived alongside an Ice Age animal that other archaeologists insisted had died out long before any human crossed into the region. The claim divided the field for years. Some of Harrington's contemporaries accepted the association at face value. Others argued that the point and the sloth remains had simply settled into the same layer by accident, disturbed ground rather than a shared moment in time, and the argument was never fully closed before later, more precise dating methods moved the whole question onto different footing entirely. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What connects a mine survey in Story County to 2 cave excavations 100 and 300 miles away is not a single buried city with one name and one fate. It is a state that spent the early 20th century sealing things away almost as fast as it uncovered them, sometimes in the same decade, sometimes for entirely opposite reasons. The Comstock's underground city was closed because it had already given up everything it had left to give, and the water finally won the fight Sutro's tunnel had only postponed by half a century. Lovelock Cave was closed to casual digging once its scientific value was recognized by outside institutions. Its baskets and remains carried off to museum collections in Berkeley for decades, before later repatriation under federal law to the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe, the people whose oral history had named the cave's occupants before an archaeologist ever set a trowel in the dirt. Gypsum Cave was eventually gated by federal land managers to keep curious visitors and outright looters from carrying off what Harrington's team had spent 2 seasons carefully cataloguing after newspaper coverage of the sloth find drew exactly the kind of foot traffic a fragile site could not survive. In each case, the record shows a short window of intense attention followed by a deliberate decision made by a mining company, a museum board, or a federal agency to shut the door and control what came out from that point forward. And in each case, before the door shut, someone stripped the site of whatever could still be moved. Comstock Merger Mines salvaged pumps, rail, cable, and every length of usable timber it could pull out before letting the water rise, so that what Voss mapped in his final survey was already closer to a shell than a working mine. Its tools gone, its rooms bare, nothing left behind but the square set frames too deep and too waterlogged to be worth the cost of hauling out. Loud's own field report from Lovelock notes that guano miners had already disturbed and removed material from parts of the cave floor before any archaeologist arrived, leaving gaps in the stratigraphy that were never fully reconciled. A site cleared before it can be studied properly is its own kind of evidence, even when nothing sinister explains the clearing. It simply means the record any later reader gets is already missing pieces nobody wrote down. Harrington himself is the clearest example in this story of a researcher who touched something significant and then quietly moved past it. After Gypsum Cave, his career carried him through a long string of other Great Basin and Southwest excavations for the Southwest Museum, but he never again published a case argued as forcefully as the Sloth Association, and later writers reviewing his correspondence have noted that he seemed to spend much of the rest of his working life on smaller, safer sites, while the argument he had started ran on without him, In journals he rarely bothered to answer directly. Deidesheimer's timbering outlived the ore it was built to support. Mining engineers who trained on the Comstock carried the square-set method to the goldfields of South Africa's Witwatersrand and to the deep reefs of Australia's Broken Hill within a decade of its first use in Nevada. And textbooks on underground support still credit a Virginia City engineer with solving a structural problem that European mines twice its depth had never managed to work out. It is a strange kind of legacy for a mountain now mostly full of water. The method that let men build a city no one could see survived the city itself by more than a century, still holding up ground on the other side of the world. What survives from all three sites tells you more about what was lost than any single artifact ever could on its own. The Comstock's tunnels are still down there, most of them flooded past any reasonable hope of re-entry, though a fraction near the surface has been reopened as a tourist route through mines like the Cholla in Virginia City, timbered exactly the way Deidesheimer designed it, cool and dry for the first 100 feet, and then, guides will tell visitors if they ask, noticeably warmer the farther any shaft was ever pushed before the company stopped digging. Voss's notebook sits today in an archive box in Reno, a handful of pencil pages describing a mountain that no longer exists in the shape he drew it that February afternoon. Lovelock's baskets and decoys are held partly in museum collections and partly returned to the tribe whose oral history named the cave's occupants before any outside record confirmed a word of it, an account that turned out to describe something physically real years before a pair of guano miners' picks stumbled onto proof of it. Gypsum Cave sits fenced today on land managed by the federal government, its sloth dung and work stone tools long since removed to storage. Its central question, whether people and an Ice Age giant once shared that patch of desert, still argued over by specialists who were not yet born when Harrington first raised it in print. Virginia City itself has built a second industry on top of the first, running walking tours past the Fourth Ward School and the old Piper's Opera House that mention the flooded levels almost in passing, the way a town mentions a fact so large it has stopped being remarkable to the people who live beside it every day. The Nevada State Museum in Carson City, itself housed in the former U.S. Mint building where Comstock silver was once coined into currency, keeps a permanent exhibit built around the district's underground workings, including a reconstructed section of square-set timber visitors can walk through without ever leaving daylight. None of these three places kept its record by accident. Each one was closed on purpose, by people with a reason that made sense to them at the time and rarely made it into the file for anyone reading later, and each closure stands today as its own kind of confirmation that something worth protecting or worth forgetting had been found underneath Nevada in those years. Voss climbed back up the Union shaft late on the afternoon of the 4th of February and handed his notebook to a company clerk who filed it without a word of comment. The pumps ran a few more months before Comstock Merger Mines let them stop for good, and the water that had been fought for 60 straight years finally rose through drifts wide enough to have stabled mules in, through underground rooms where men once ate meals a mile beneath the mountain's surface, through a maze a 19th century journalist had once called a city that never saw daylight. It is still down there tonight, sealed by water instead of stone or a fence, in the same handful of years that two cave floors 300 miles apart were opened for the first time in longer than either had a name for. Voss never went back down after that February. His name appears once more in the Story County record on a 1934 survey of a different, smaller claim near Gold Hill, and then it stops. No obituary, no retirement notice. Just a working man's name that shows up in an archive box for a handful of years and then does not show up again, one more small gap in a record already full of them. Nevada spent 1931, both losing a city and finding two, and the state, in the 95 years since, has never quite decided which of those three events it once remembered first. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.